Hey everyone. Today we will be talking through ISMS 11, the Statement of Applicability. And with me, I have Matt Cooper, our in-house subject matter expert on all things security and compliance. We will take you through the template we have in Vanta for you all, as well as layer in some knowledge that Matt has and how to approach this part of the Statement of Applicability. So over to you, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. All right, friends, the ISO statement of applicability. So Caitlin, if you want to pull up the first page of the template, on our template, we start with some instructions, how to fill it out. And then Caitlin, I'm going to have you walk through like tab by tab. And there's a title page is the next one we can go to. I'm not going to stay here because I'm just going to tell you how to do it. So you have your company name, your owner, your date that's effective, and then your version history is the next tab. This is the tab you can use to show that you are doing annual updates, or you can track that in Vanta, whatever you prefer. So then let's jump into the actual, no, before we do that, you can see we have a bunch of different tabs. So we've created a master template that you can use as your statement of applicability for any and all of the ISO 27000 standards that you're doing. So if you're on 2013, you would use that one. Most folks, now that it's October of 2023, are going to be probably starting with the 2022 version. So that's what we're going to go to. But then if you add ISO extensions like 27701, 2717, or 18, you could then add additional controls on those tabs. But for today, we'll just start with the 27001 2022 tab. Okay. So let's talk through the statement of applicability. The statement of applicability is very much an ISO specific governance document. So you do not have to do this if you're just doing SOC 2. And the way it works is that according to the ISO framework, the clauses are mandatory. So those clauses, which are weirdly numbered 4 through 10, all of the things that those say, you have to do to comply with the framework. And then separately, they have these annex controls, the Annex A controls, A.5.x. And in the new version of ISO, the 2022 version, they rebucketed them. So there's only 4 categories now. There's section 5, 6, 7, and 8. And so there's a lot more controls in each one because they made a fewer number of buckets. So what you're doing here is you're basically saying which of these controls are in scope for us and our management system. So the way ISO works is, contrary to what a lot of folks think, you don't have to do all of the Annex A controls. You can actually select any controls that you want to use for your ISMS based on your risk profile chosen from any source that you want. I'm not going to go into that further on this call. It can get a little bit complex. Most folks will just simply choose the Annex A. That's kind of the easy button, I would say. It's what the auditor's most used to seeing. And so once you've selected the Annex A as your control set, then you're going to go through and you're going to specifically scope each control in or out. And it's supposed to be based on risk. So if we look at the form, what we essentially have then is the list of all the Annex A controls and whether they're included or excluded. And so in the exclusion line, we have this little box that says justification for exclusion. Because you're not just excluding these controls because you don't want to do them. You're supposed to exclude them for some legitimate reason. Ideally, they are not relevant to you based on your risk profile. But there could be other reasons too. Maybe they're just not feasible for you to do and you can't do them. And so you're going to exclude them. But we'll get into some of those details. If you're not going to exclude them, you're going to include them. And on the inclusion, we've created a simpler field, which is just simply a checkbox. And we've given you 4 categories to choose from. Now, technically, you could actually include, for other reasons too. You could make this a free form field, but we try to make it easier for folks. And the reality is the auditor is going to be most likely more interested in the controls you're excluding to make sure they feel that that's, appropriate rather than what you're including. So if you're including them, that generally doesn't get a ton of scrutiny from the auditor. And so ISO is a best practice standard. And so all of these could be included as a matter of best practice. If you have specific risks on your risk assessment, You can indicate that with the RA field. If you had a regulatory requirement, you could include those. Now, because ISO itself is not a regulation, just because you feel like you needed to do them for ISO, that really wouldn't be regulatory. It'd be more like if you were doing, say, HIPAA, something like that, and there were controls that were mandated on a regulation. Or if you had a contractual obligation, that would be another option. Now, I know some folks are going to say, Matt, wait, all these are supposed to be tied to your risk register. But if you look at the language of the clauses, really what it says is after you've done your risk register and you've determined your controls, you need to go check the Annex A controls to make sure you didn't miss anything. Because basically the idea here is, the ISO committee had a more complete list than you might have thought of for yourself. And so if you're just taking the controls, then you're not excluding them, right? So the tie to the risk assessment, I feel doesn't need to be as exacting in that case. If you're excluding them, the audit may want to see that you can really show that you've thought about this and don't feel it's relevant to your risk. Okay, so that's the context. What do you have to do? Really, you have to go through each control and mark it in or out, included or excluded. That's it. And so we've pre-filled the form for you based on what a lot of our customers typically do, but you need to go through and make sure it's correct for you. So generally, we're going to accept the Annex A controls, but there's a handful of them that many folks are going to scope out. Okay, now I see, Casey, that you're highlighting the status field. The idea here is the status field could be used for you while you're getting compliant, but by the time you go to audit, the expectation is that these controls are implemented. Good. Or if you've excluded them, then there could be a different status. Okay. So let's just slowly scroll down and look at the way we've templated a few of these, and I'll just voice those over. 5.21 we've excluded here. So actually there's an error in this form. So the BP should be deleted in this particular version for that to be more correct, because this basically says we're including and excluding. So I'm just knitting that. Yeah, I would delete that basically. Yeah. Then that's how it should look to be excluded. So note to our template, we gotta clean it up. So managing information security in the information and communication technology supply chain. So if you look into the guidance on this control, what this is really talking about is you go to your vendors, and in your contract or something like that, you dictate to your vendors that they implement information security downstream in their supply chain. Well, the reality is, if you're doing business with an Amazon or something like that, and you're a SaaS company, you don't really have the clout to tell Amazon how to source their material, how to source their infrastructure, et cetera. And so you're going to basically just have to defer to them on that. If you were the Department of Defense, right, it would be different. Then you could actually, you'd have the clout to implement some of these controls downstream. So that's not really feasible for most commercial companies, and that's why I typically advise or suggest that we exclude it. Let's keep moving down the list. The other things we're going to commonly exclude are going to be some of the physical security controls. So you're not typically, if you're a SaaS company, controlling security to the data center, and that would be oftentimes handled by your third-party provider. So perimeter, protecting against environmental threats. So this is fire prevention and humidity monitoring, stuff like that. That's going to be conducted by your data center provider. Working in the secure areas. Again, that's probably not relevant to you if you're not managing your own data center. Equipment siting and protection, cabling, security, utilities, maintenance. Those are all things that we commonly exclude. Now, we've left a handful of the security controls in, the physical ones, because some of these could be relevant to an office space, or could even be relevant to a remote workspace, like a clear desk, clear screen policy. So in all cases, this is still just a template for you, and you need to go through and make sure you adjust it to be right for your environment. But this is pretty common exclusions for a lot of our customers. Everything else is scoped in here. I don't think, yep, and that's pretty much it. So that is a statement of applicability. It's telling the auditor which of the Annex A controls are in scope for my ISMS so they know what to audit. That's the long and the short of it. Hopefully that was helpful.
Can you give us a bit more info on this? Like Reg, Con, CP, and RA. Like, so these are best practices, but like when would some of these others come into play?
Sure. So if you had if you were like, okay, if you were in scope, well, first off, let me just say, different companies could interpret this differently, and they could fill it out differently, and they could both be fine. Okay, it's really a tool to show which controls are in scope. So I would say a couple of the regulatory ones would be like if you're doing HIPAA. And if HIPAA, makes you do somewhat of access control, so I'm looking at like 5.15, and I have PHI in my system, I could check the box for regulatory. Could I uncheck the box for BP? Sure, but I could have multiple boxes checked for why I want to include it. I could have overlapping reasons why I want to include it. Contractually, right? When we get into when many companies do business with a larger enterprise, they will actually have security requirements, maybe a security standard or something like that they impose upon their vendors. And so you'll end up agreeing to a number of things contractually. And so that would be a case where you could check the CON box for contract. And then lastly, risk assessment. If you had, risks that you were calling out specifically in your risk assessment, and some of these Annex A controls were chosen to address those, you could check that box as well. And you could, like I said, you can have multiple boxes checked. That's totally fine. The only thing you don't want to do is have exclusion and inclusion checked, because that's confusing. It should be one or the other there.
Got it. Okay. I think that's it.
Great.